Loud. Perfect. Okay, so I will turn off my sound as soon as we start because then otherwise everyone thinks I'm hoovering. So, welcome everyone. It is the 25th of January 2024, and we have UX Research Call number 32. The goal of this call is to actually learn from each other and specifically to learn from Eric. Eric has very kindly offered to jump on a call with us as the community and share a little bit of his processes around how he does sprints, how he plans sprints, and how, as well as how he does interviews. And it's an open space for everyone to learn and to ask questions. So thank you very much, Eric. I will hand over the floor to you, and I will, happy to ready to learn.
Okay, sweet. And everyone can hear me? Okay, perfect.
Yep.
Let me go ahead and share my screen. Is it visible for you guys? Do you see sprint planning?
Yep. Looks great.
Okay, perfect. So I don't have access to Jitsi, so if somebody has their hand raised or something, I won't be able to see. So just go ahead and interrupt me if there's any comments or anything like that. And is my camera still showing?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I'll just jump into it. Maybe I can start with an introduction. Who am I? What do I do? So my name is Eric. I'm a UX designer, and I work for a Bitcoin startup called Hoseki that does proof of reserves. But I also contribute to some open source Bitcoin projects, ones that I think are interesting. In the past, I've contributed to a Lightning node management software called Citadel, and recently I've been contributing to eCash on Bitcoin projects. Specifically, I'm kind of focused on one that's called eNuts, which is a mobile wallet that lets you use eCash on top of Bitcoin. So throughout my experience working at both kind of Bitcoin startups that are a little bit more organized, they have a little bit more funding, and also in my experience in working in open source projects where it's a little bit more free and open and it's less kind of regimented, I've come across kind of different techniques, best practices, and ways of going about incorporating design into the development process. And I want to share some of that with you guys. So, some of the things that I want to cover are the common design practice as it exists and some of the pitfalls and how we can avoid them. The main phases of design and development that I've come across and how you can integrate them into a sprint and what it looks like when you're working in a very regimented sprint and a more kind of, contribute when you can. Your time is voluntary. The kind of distinction between what I call a concept and a detailed design, which I'll get into in a little bit more detail. But these concept and detail designs are what I kind of think are two of the crucial parts of the design process. Then I want to talk about how to integrate design into the greater sprint workflow and working with developers. And lastly, I want to get into user interviews, where they fit in the process and how I have conducted them in the past and what tools I use. So let's kind of jump into the design process. So there's already a lot of different models out there for how you could, use design in software development. There's the double diamond, there's design thinking. I'm sure that a lot of you guys have at least heard of these, and maybe some people on this call I know are very intimately familiar. So I won't kind of rehash that, but I do think that we can all agree there's kind of two processes when it comes to design and development. There's quite obviously the design process and the development process. And very often it's different people or different teams of people with different skill sets doing this. And in an ideal world, what you're doing in the design process is designing. This is where the design should happen. And then you hand it off to developers, and then they take your beautiful designs and they implement them. And the process is very clear and it's like magic, and everyone is happy and there's never any delays. But it doesn't usually work that way. Often I find that even in the development process, there's still design happening. And I've kind of realized that there are reasons for this, and it comes down to not having an optimized workflow and design operations process with developers. So I think that the goal is to avoid re- doing a lot of design in the development stage. And how can we kind of optimize for that? And what are the problems with that? So it leads to frustration sometimes, and it leads to delays. Maybe I think that this is less common in open source work because everyone is just kind of thankful to get a contribution, and we understand that people are busy and we're a little bit more open with our time. But when you're working at a startup with very tight deadlines and tight deliveries, it can kind of have a different feeling. It can have a different impact on the organization. So, what are these kind of main phases of design and development? So, there's 5 that I think are kind of the main ones. And even though what I'm presenting to you guys looks like it's a very linear thing, I want to stress that it's not. And quite often, the closer you are to the beginning, to this requirements part, the more likely you are to be jumping in between different phases. I like to think of these as almost like lanes on a highway. And the closer you are to the beginning, the more often you're going to be changing lanes and going at different speeds in order to get to where you're going, which is ultimately, development handoff. So keep that in mind, that it's not uncommon to kind of jump between phases. But where do you start? So you usually start with some type of requirement. You're usually, as a designer, you're trying to solve a problem. And what we do is we try to solve some type of problem using user experience and visual design techniques. And it starts with understanding what are the technical requirements and limitations for what we're trying to do. What do we need to remove? What could we work with? And this, you start kind of understanding these requirements by, you can look at documentation. If you're designing something that's very specific, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to refer to stuff that I'm working on with eNuts, which is an eCash wallet, because I think that's kind of an actionable example. So I can start with understanding, how does eCash on Bitcoin work? What are the limitations? What are the technical requirements? How is it different, and how is it similar to transacting and interacting with Bitcoin? So depending on what I'm trying to do, I start with trying to understand the requirements in detail. Then I jump into what I call concept design. And this could be done in low fidelity or mid fidelity. I don't recommend doing it in high fidelity, and I'll explain why in a couple seconds. But concept design to me is more than just lo-fis. It's more than just sketching things out on paper. It's where you are exploring different iterations of ideas to solve the problem. So different layouts, different user flows. You're thinking about the problem at a very, very high level, and you're just throwing all the possible ideas that you have that might work to solve it. And while you're doing this, you're very free to explore. So the UI design should in no means be final. The colors, the copy should not be final. And I put user interviews in bold here because this is where I think that user conducting user interviews can add a lot of value. That's not to say that you can't conduct user interviews when you're doing detailed design. It's not rigid. And quite often, as I mentioned earlier, you'll be jumping between these two stages. So you might find yourself conducting user interviews at various stages. The next stage is what I call detail design. So this is more than high fidelity design, because I think about a detail design as almost like an architect would think about a blueprint that you hand off to the actual engineers or the builders. So this detail design should be very, very clearly defined at a low level as to what exactly the app or the piece of software should look like. You should define each and every interaction if possible. If, for example, you're designing a coin control setting where the user can navigate to a payment option and then expand an accordion, and then they can see certain options, input fields to select. Well, what does it look like when you expand that accordion and it, breaks the breakpoint on the screen? You have to scroll up and down. And what does it look like when you select something? What is the selection state? And if you go back, to a previous menu, are you going to save or communicate the changes that you made in that menu to this stage? And kind of designing for all the possible edge cases. What if you get an error? Like, what should that look like? How should we communicate that to the user? Should it be a modal? Should it be a menu that slides up from the bottom? Is there, a 50% opacity behind it to draw attention to it? Detailed design is where you really, really flesh this out in its totality so that you're ready to go to handoff. And this is where you can also, if time allows, conduct usability testing, which is where you actually put this prototype in front of people, have them use it, and figure out what's working, what's not working. And during this process, it's not uncommon to be knocked back to the concept. You might find that as you're fleshing out a detailed design, you might maybe second guess if the design that you chose to go with is the best one. And you might think, well, remember that old concept I did where instead of an accordion, I had, all of them listed in tiles that you swiped to left or right? Why don't I go back and explore that? And then you might bounce back to concept design, depending on the feedback you get or your own thinking. So keep in mind, you're going back and forth. Eventually, you get to development where there's various ways to hand off design to development. It's kind of out of scope of this call for me to go into all the different types of handoff techniques and software, but Figma as a tool has launched dev mode, so they've made it a lot easier and a lot more useful to hand this off to developers in a way where they can take a detailed look at exactly at the user interface and the user experience, and as close as possible replicate it one to one. They could look at the pixel spacing, what type of font is being used, what is the hex code for the color, for the hover state or the input state. All that can be, if you design it well enough in the detailed phase, it can be handed off in the development phase so that the quality of the design isn't jeopardized. And lastly, something that's often overlooked is this kind of QA process where instead of just handing it off to developers and letting it now go live, before you get to that stage, you want to, whether that's downloading a beta version on test flight or maybe running the new app, the new version locally on your computer, you want to do a QA. You want to go back and literally, on one hand, if it's a phone, run through the flow and compare it to the prototype and make sure and find if there's discrepancies that jeopardize the user experience, or if there are things that aren't lining up, and then you want to document those and send it back. I want to briefly kind of emphasize the difference between concept and detail design. So I mentioned that I recommend concept be either lo-fi or mid-fi, and there's no really wrong way to do it. You could do it by hand. I like to use wireframe templates or wireframe kits, where I just kind of take these black and white components that already exist and I just kind of like Legos, explore ideas, but whatever works best for you. But it should be very, very high level. It should be a lot of different concepts that you're exploring. And detail design is not just a direct translation to that. I mentioned this earlier, but it's thinking about things like, what does the interaction look like when you expand? If you select individual elements like this, what is the input state? If I were to close this this payment overview screen, what would the animation be? Would it slide down? Would it slide to the left? Is there going to be a spring? Is there going to be a bounce? What are the different animations for closing this accordion and the edge cases? Detail design is this kind of work. So keeping those 5 design phases in mind, when you're working with a team that's very regimented, or if you're working at a startup that has a very, very defined process as to how long sprints are and things of that nature, there's ways that I have found work to integrate the 2 design stages and the design process into the sprint workflow. So in this example, I'm used to working in 3-week sprints, but of course, this is going to vary depending on, one, if you're working at a startup that has clearly defined this, or if you're working on an open source project where the sprints might not be defined in weeks. Maybe this is more, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. However you choose to kind of map your journey will depend on what project you're working on. But generally, I like to follow this process. So I mentioned earlier the requirements. So before you start the sprint, you should already be researching the technical requirements. You should be referencing the documentation, listening to a podcast if that's helpful, talking to developers, lurking in the developer channels and seeing what they're talking about. Understand whatever it is you're designing at a high level. And for the first week, or for the first, sprint, you want to focus on this concept design where you're exploring multiple iterations. And this is a good time to get feedback, not just from developers, not just from, other designers, but also from resources like the Bitcoin design community. You can get feedback even at this stage. You can go to the Bitcoin design community and throw out your idea and just throw out a thread, and people will give design feedback. One thing that I'm going to try to do this year is get better at jumping in that channel and sharing my concepts, sharing my detailed designs, getting feedback, and also giving feedback to other people that are sharing, because the design community is really invaluable in that regard, where something that's very low effort for you, which is just making a post and throwing your idea out there, can yield incredible results. So let's utilize that resource. And if we all become a little bit more active on it, it becomes more useful. This is also where you can conduct user research, as I mentioned, in the form of interviews. You could conduct usability testing at this stage too if you feel it requires it. But the goal is after concept design, you have a very, very clear idea of what the requirements are going into the high detailed design. And during the second sprint, you want to focus on this detailed design. And you should still be getting feedback. You should still be conducting user research if time allows for you to do this. Once you're done, or you feel like you've gotten the detailed design at a well enough space, you want to get approval or sign off of your detailed design from the appropriate people. This could be developers, this could be a product owner or a product manager, whoever these people are that grant you approval, or even it could be just somebody whose opinion that you really, really value. You want to get that and then hand it off, and then you're ready for development and to do QA. But often during this development process, you will still need to offer design support in some way. It's not uncommon to come across an edge case that maybe you didn't think of that a developer will bring up to you. So keep in mind that it doesn't mean that once you hand it off to development that you totally stop with all forms of design. The goal is to try to limit the amount of redesign that could have been accomplished for things that are a little bit more obvious during the earlier sprints. So the example I showed you was this really like perfect, linear process of everything is in perfect 3-week sprints, and you have just the right amount of time for concept design, and you have the same exact amount of time for detail design and the same exact amount of time for development. But in the real world, it almost never works that way because it depends on what feature you're working on. It's very rare that everything kind of maps out perfectly in 3-week bands and you can just spend that time at these same exact phases. So the amount of time that you spend at different stages really, really depends on what problem you're trying to solve and how complex it is. So for example, if you're trying to work on a very small feature, like maybe on the home screen you've gotten a request from users, or you've decided that you want to add a privacy feature where the balance is hidden on the home screen of eNuts or some type of wallet. Well, a feature like that, it might not require a whole sprint worth of concept design, right? Because there's a lot of conventions that have already established how you handle privacy mode on a financial application. It could be you hitting like the hide icon on the home screen and then the balance disappears. It could be in the settings where you toggle, enable hide balance or something like that. But there's a lot of work that's already been laid out for a small feature like that. And a feature of that nature might also not require a lot of deep dive and highly detailed design because you're only making maybe a couple changes to a couple screens. So you can, make those phases shorter, and you might want to focus more on development and QA of that feature if it's a small feature. There are certain instances where you might be updating an existing an existing piece of functionality or an existing flow. So if it's an update to something that has already been built, well, then maybe you'll already have a clear understanding of the requirements at a technical level because it's a feature that's already exists that you might have already designed. And you can spend more time exploring concepts, thinking about different solutions. For an example, on eNuts right now, what I'm exploring is how can you create an easy to understand interface for managing multiple mints. So I can spend a lot of time on concept design thinking about how do we display multiple mints to a user and communicate what's happening with the mints and what they can do and how they can interact with them, since I already have a clear understanding of how mints work. And the detailed design maybe won't be that heavy because we've already kind of established a design system, a design language on eNuts where I can just focus on the concept, just focus on the different solutions. If you're designing and developing or deploying a brand new feature, well then you can imagine a situation where the majority of your time could be spent in development, or most time can be spent in concept design or detail design, or even gathering requirements. For example, if you're integrating something like Nostr into your application, and maybe you're not familiar with Nostr, well, you're going to have to spend a lot of time looking up the technical requirements. How does Nostr work? what does it mean to integrate Nostr? Are you just allowing users to connect their NSEC or their private key and then see notes, or are you allowing them to see a list of contacts, people who they're following? What does it mean to integrate Nostr? And then you're gonna have to spend more time thinking about the concept design because it's new and unfamiliar to you. And as a result, you'll probably have to spend more time about the detail design because now there's new things that you might have not accounted for, like relays, like displaying contacts. And you can imagine development might take twice as long because they're implementing something brand new into the code base. They're interacting with another protocol. So if it's a brand new feature that requires a lot of effort, well, then, the amount of time that you spend on each stage is going to vary. So I mentioned user interviews earlier and where they fall into the process, and I want to segue into them a little bit more. I want to talk about how I conduct them, how I recruit people, and where they're most useful. As I mentioned, they're most useful when you're starting this concept stage. That's not to say this is the only place that you can conduct user interviews, but this is a good place to start doing it. When you're exploring different concepts, you can start talking to people and getting an idea for what is their experience either with your application or with other applications that are similar, or just at a very, very high level, what's their thoughts about the protocol if you need. It really just depends on what you're trying to solve. So how do you go about conducting user research? Sorry, excuse me for a second. I can tell you what I've done and what I find out that works. There's the saying, what is it, like showing up is half the battle. I think for what I found for recruiting is that asking people is half the battle. So quite literally, in what you see here on the left is an example of how we got users to participate in user research at Hoseki. We literally just threw out a tweet on Twitter. But it doesn't have to be Twitter. You can use Nostr, you can use GitHub, you can use Discord. Wherever you think your users are, that's where you want to ask. And you can just ask people. In the Bitcoin community, there's a lot of people that are really passionate and excited about Bitcoin, and they're happy to try something new. It's a lot of people are just really passionate about this, and it's an interest of them, and they want to just see what's out there. So I found that people are more than willing to give up some of their time to volunteer 30 or 45 minutes just to take a look at what you're working. So you ask, you throw it out there. I like to use a type form or a Google form or some type of input form where I ask users a little bit of their information, mostly their social media handles, because I like to screen users before. It's very rare that I interview someone that doesn't provide any information, just because depending on if what I'm interviewing, if the information that I'm trying to get is super, super detailed, I want to make sure that this is someone who might already have experience with the thing. For example, if it's related to Bitcoin Lightning, and I don't even know if this user has ever interacted with Bitcoin, then it might not be the most fruitful conversation for this interview, for this goal that I'm trying to accomplish. So I always screen, which is very simple. I just look at their whatever social media that they linked, whether that's their Twitter, their Nostr. I get an idea for how active they are. Are they posting about, managing liquidity on their own Lightning node? Okay, then I know that this is a pretty advanced user if they're managing their own Lightning node. Are they, somebody that is tweeting more about Bitcoin as an investment, and they're, discussing what are the best exchanges? Okay, then I know that this is a user that, might not be very familiar with the technical aspects of Bitcoin, but they're familiar with, maybe Bitcoin on a more monetary level, and they want to learn more. So this helps me understand what kind of person I'm going to be speaking to. You can also, look them up on LinkedIn if they provided you that information, so you get an idea of where they work. This is maybe less relevant for open source, but if you're working on at a Bitcoin startup where there's NDAs involved, you want to be careful with interviewing people that could potentially be competitors or things like that. But in open source, this isn't really an issue. But just keep that in mind, depending on if you're working with a startup that has NDAs and things of that nature. So next, after the screening, I send invites. I use an app called Calendly, which lets people pick a time where they want to meet with you. Some people kind of dislike that. Other people like it. I personally like it because it gives freedom to the user where they pick, the time that works for them. If you're working at a startup where NDAs are required, you want to be clear about that and attach it. Maybe not so relevant for open source. And one thing I like to do is I like to ask for permission to record the session in the email that I send out when I invite them, because I don't like to take notes while I'm conducting the interview because it's very hard for me to mentally do both. And I also think that the interviewee also sees that you're taking notes and they get an idea that you're kind of doing something else, and they might, maybe pull back or be like less engaged because they feel like your mind is elsewhere. So I like to record the sessions if possible. And it's always helpful to know beforehand if someone is comfortable doing that. So next, I want to share just an example of kind of how I go about conducting the interview. And for the purposes of this presentation, I've kind of put it together in this Figma example. I usually use Notion or Microsoft Word, but you can use whatever works for you. And after a while of conducting interviews, you start to kind of get into a flow. But you always start with an introduction. And the goal is to keep this interview in between informal and serious. And that might seem kind of vague. And what I mean by that is that you want it to feel like you're just having a relaxed conversation with the person. But I've also found that people like some type of structure. People like to feel like what you're doing is serious business. And they like to feel like, oh, okay, I'm in to really look at some software. It makes them feel like they're almost being, when they are, like they're a part of the development process when you keep it kind of serious at the same time. So I start off with, just introducing myself, explaining who I am, what I do. I often like to explain what a user experience designer does because I don't like to assume people know. And also, it makes it kind of clear what I'm here to do. So I explain to them who I am, what I'm doing, the fact that this is not a test. There's no right or wrong answers. I'm just kind of here to learn about their experience. And before you go into the user interview, I should also mention that you want to establish very clear goals, very clear objectives. So in this example, maybe what I would want to know going into this interview is, hey, I want to speak to people who have used eNuts in the past, and I want to know what do they like about eNuts, what do they dislike, what's clear, what's unclear about the UX, so that in the next sprint I can have time to improve existing functionality. So part of that is understanding people who have already used the app. I want to know more about their experience, and I'll kind of define some objectives around that. So if that's the high level objective, the first kind of phase might be understanding the user's background and experience. The second phase might be understanding their specific interaction with eNuts. And the third might be identifying some parts that are confusing about eNuts or that they found challenging. And then I also want to ask questions that compare their experience of using eNuts with other Bitcoin Layer 2 wallets, other Lightning wallets. So I might make a list of these are 4 kind of specific objectives that I want to uncover during this session. And then I'll just formulate some questions. And like I mentioned, I'm usually doing this in just a Word document, but you can use whatever tool you want. So I'll formulate some questions that are related to that objective. If I want to know about their user background, I'll ask them, how often do you use Bitcoin in your daily life? What other Bitcoin wallets have you used? What's your overall experience with Bitcoin or crypto? Even though a lot of us working on the Bitcoin design community are Bitcoin focused, I actually find that a lot of people are very familiar with other crypto projects, and Bitcoin is just one crypto project that they're interested in. So I always open the door to learn more. Maybe they had a really good experience with a chain that I'm unfamiliar with, like Solana, and they can describe to me, oh yeah, I was using this Solana app and I really liked how it did X, Y, and Z for me. And I see that as a learning experience. Like, okay, well, that's an experience they had with another app that they found pleasant. Even though it's a chain that I might not be involved with, I can still learn from what it was about that made them feel like it was a memorable experience. My second objective is to understand eNuts specifically. I might ask them, I always like to ask, what was your initial impression when you use the tool? Or if you're conducting usability tests and you put a screen in front of them for the first time, I would ask them, all right, can you walk me through your initial impression? What is it that you think you're seeing on the screen, and what is it that you think you can do? Or something like that. I like to keep it open. So I'll ask questions that are tailored to their specific experience with eNuts. And since the goal of this interview was to identify some things that could be improved on the user experience of eNuts, I'll now start focusing on, well, hey, what was it, if anything, that was confusing or challenging about eNuts? So I'll ask them, what aspects of the mobile app did you find confusing or maybe less intuitive compared to other wallets? Was there any specific challenge or problem that you encountered while you were trying to use eNuts? Maybe you had trouble connecting to a mint, or you didn't understand why you had to connect to a mint in the first place. Getting that kind of information is useful. Then another objective, something that I like to ask is, I like to know about other experiences people have had with other Bitcoin products or crypto products. As I touched on earlier, I always like to ask, can you share with me a very positive experience you had with a Bitcoin or a crypto project that was very memorable? And what was it that you liked about that application? What is it that they did that made it feel special? Something along those lines. So I might want to ask here, like, can you compare your experience with eNuts with another Bitcoin layer 2 wallet that you like? Maybe they're using a liquid wallet, or they're using a custodial Lightning wallet, or even a self-custodial Lightning wallet like Phoenix. I want to know about, what is it about that app that they liked, and if they can compare that experience with eNuts, what was the difference? Or maybe they'll tell me that they thought eNuts was more user friendly in their existing app, and they liked that we were doing this right. Whatever the case may be, these are very open conversations, but it helps to have objectives and then tailor the questions that are specific to uncovering more about that objective. And then what I do after is, since I have these sessions recorded, I'm not usually ever taking notes during the sessions. I go back and I listen to them at 1.2, 1.5x speed, usually right after, while everything is fresh in my head, and then I'll go back and I'll take notes and I'll kind of analyze it. And analyzing and presenting user research to developers, and finding what insights are actually actionable, which ones are critical, which ones are maybe non-critical, which ones require more research. Analyzing user research data is probably outside of the scope of this call, and there are a lot of different ways to do that. But yeah, the analysis is kind of its own phase. But this is kind of the overall process that I try to follow when I'm designing, both at startups and at on open source projects. Luckily, one of the things I like about working on open source projects is that it's not as you're not really bound by sprint 1, sprint 2, and things like that. It's You're more kind of working on problems in phases. So there's often this kind of top part here where there's time and pressure requirements are kind of gone, and you're kind of a little bit more free to take as much time as you need to clear this phase and then go on to that phase. So that's all I got. I'd like to open the floor for questions, comments, feedback. If anyone has any. Thank you.
You just needed to clap. That was so good. I just want to do that. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
You put so much of effort into putting that whole presentation together. I absolutely did not expect such a well put together presentation.
Oh, thanks.
So good. Thank you so much. You gave us all on this call a beautiful user experience.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Christoph shares my sentiment. Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. I'll make some quick comments. I took down some notes. I love the analogy that you said. It's like throwing spaghetti at the wall when you're working with the less detailed designs. I love that
Yes.
analogy, throwing spaghetti at the wall. I'd love to have, if you're open with sharing this actual Figma design file with, or not, I don't need the design file, but sharing this with the community. I'd absolutely love that, because I think that there's so much that we can use for this, also for the UX Research Toolkit call, which we also have coming up.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to say, definitely had a realization as you were talking that there's definitely a need for another call within the community about the analysis of
Yes.
UX research. That is something that takes researchers. It can be
Yep.
something that can be very, very fast, but it can also be something that can just lag on and take forever. And I think now that we have AI, we have so many opportunities to use that. but we're going to have to ask for consent and permission from users, because once you're uploading transcripts onto publicly available sources, then you're actually making that data of that interview open to the rest of the world. We don't know who owns and who controls that data. But yeah, that's it for me. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'll open the floor to everyone else to ask questions and to give him compliments. It was really good. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for the kind words. And yeah, analysis is kind of another whole really kind of deep thing to go down. And there's a lot of ways. I still kind of struggle with the best way to present my analysis to team members, but I've come across things that work. I find that they like actionable insights and things organized in priorities when you actually kind of finish with the analysis.
I'd love to learn more of that from you, and then possibly have another call in the community, not next week, but further along down the line, on how to analyze and present
Mhm.
research findings. But yeah, I'll hand it over to the rest of the floor.
I have a question, apart from the praise as well. It was really, really great. Also great kind of pace, and
Oh, thanks.
I loved it. Yeah, well, while you were talking about working at startups and things, there were always like when I was, or in any company, there are always like there's not one project going on, right? There is like a lot of parallel work,
Mhm.
and these different projects are in different
Yep.
stages of their um, existence. So that means you have. I like the analogy with these lanes, in the car lane, but then you have additional highways left and right to
Yeah,
them.
exactly.
Is how do you what's your experience with kind of managing all of these different kind of streams?
Yeah. So
Is
I
it
think, no, go ahead.
No, that's it. I'm just curious how other people deal with that pain.
Yeah, so one thing I did was, or that I thought about doing um in this example, was actually including multiple different stages, kind of like what you suggested. So I like to think about it like this workflow example is one where you're starting brand new and you're fresh and you've done the requirements. But like you said, there are instances where you're in, just imagine if this was duplicated and you're working on another thing, right? Stage 2 and stage 3, and those might be at different stages. So there's different design processes in play. Project management software is kind of my friend there. I think a lot of people, it's kind of tough in open source because I'm not as much of a GitHub wizard as I would like to be. So I work very much in issues and bookmarks. But the way that I like to manage it is I like to think about it kind of, as you said, this is one highway. This is one piece, one feature functionality that I'm working on. It's in this stage, and then I just think about it like, oh, we have this other piece of functionality, whatever it's called, it's in another stage. So they're already doing development in QA, and keeping in mind that at any time during development in QA we might be knocked back to detailed design or concept. Juggling those is kind of a challenge, and um, keeping in mind varying levels of effort and complexity helps, because this is not only what the feature is, but also what stage you're at. So I guess to answer your question, how do I manage it? I kind of live and die by Linear and Jira. I'm very meticulous about leaving comments
Mhm.
about, even to myself. Even if I know that nobody will read those comments, I'll go in the subtask and I'll leave like a detailed comment about, updated screens, 64 through 71 to focus on, coin control selection and whatever the case may be. Because if that's something that I'm going to come back to in a week or whatever, I like to know where I left off. So documenting things for yourself, and just
Mhm.
staying organized in your project management software.
It sounds like it's more about self-discipline than anything else, right? It's um,
Yeah, I mean, it
Nice.
helps if you have like a product manager, or like in some of the corporate environments I worked in, you have like a business analyst slash like product person who kind of helps keep you on track. They'll like ping you or remind you, hey, what's the progress on this? Will this be ready by the end of the sprint? So it's always nice when you have someone like that too.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I worked in a couple of big corporations where even if you have that, you just get you burn out basically because there is just too much. So kind of probably a selection. Also, saying no to things is probably also part of it, right?
Yeah, I once heard an analogy or a story about the team at Craigslist. Apparently, they're like a pretty small team. I think it's like less than 75 or 50 people, and they do like $1 billion like in revenue a year. This is what I've heard secondhand, so somebody can fact check all this. But they were saying that like the head architect and the team of that, one of the things that he thinks is his most important job is saying no and telling people, no, we're not going to implement that. No, we're not going to change the design. No, no. Let me tell you why we shouldn't do that. So, because the analogy they gave was like it's like a giant shipping. What do you call that? A shipping freighter in the ocean. And you don't want to change the engine and you don't want to change the direction too much because you're more likely to break it. So it's just keeping it afloat. So yeah, saying no is a superpower.
Right. And for I was also curious. Sorry, I'm gonna stop hijacking for the notes that you mentioned when you go after the interviews when you take notes. Do you use kind of software like Otter or something like that where you also get transcripts and kind of work with these, or do you just have it? You have a video file and you just kind of have a Notion doc or something where you take notes.
Yeah, so in the corporate world, I've never used Otter. I've always wanted to. We were never able to get like a license clearing at the two corporates I worked at. I've used Microsoft Teams transcription, which is useful. It's helpful. Um, I've heard of or I've seen an AI app called Firefly that I haven't used, but I've kind of been looking into it. That not only does the recording and the transcription, but gives you recommendations. But I haven't actually looked into that tool, or its like privacy implications, or have gotten it approved. What I usually do, I mean, it sounds kind of archaic, but like I said, I literally just play back the recording right after, and then just focus and take notes. In some circumstances where I have had people that didn't want to be recorded, and what I've done there is I was able to get a team member, another UX researcher, another person to take notes while I'm conducting the interview, because otherwise it would be impossible for me to just remember everything. But I'm like a caveman in that regard, where I'm still listening back to the recording at 1.2, 1.5x, and then taking my notes. I would love to explore the transcription tools and what they have to offer, but I just don't have a lot of experience with them.
Thanks.
Floor is open for questions, so feel free to jump in. PaperPsych has put a question in here. I'll read it out if that's okay. I wanted to ask about the concept. PaperPsych, would you like to speak and ask the question yourself, or would you prefer if one of us reads it out to you? The floor is open for everyone. So just type in the chat or.
Their mic is
faulty. Okay, I'll read out the question.
Sure.
I wanted to ask about the concept design stage. Sometimes for me, most times, I feel there is a need to let ideas ferment, but the client doesn't want to allocate that amount of time to the designer because their project gets delayed just because the designer is waiting for the cloudiness to go away and for ideas to become clearer. How should I, as a designer, become more confident in presenting ideas which, according to me, are not there yet, but because of the deadlines, I have to present them or just something to the product designer or client. All right, that was the question.
Yeah, so this is something I kind of have a decent amount of experience with, because I can relate. I've been in this situation before where you have limited time and you also sometimes have a client or a stakeholder or a team of developers who have already kind of have an idea for what they think the ideal solution is, because they as developers might already think we have, this code base or these components that we can just copy and paste or implement here, and it won't be a lot of effort and it'll fit into the sprint. Maybe the stakeholder has just made assumptions. For whatever reason, you're in a position where you're on a tight deadline and you don't have a lot of time to explore different concepts and you need to deliver something. So what I do typically is I focus on creating a concept that is as close to a one-to-one as what they envision, what they think they want, what they say they want, even if I think that it might be slightly incorrect, or if I think they're making assumptions and they've already solved the problem and have put in the acceptance criteria in the description a solution that I as a UX designer have recognized, hey, you're putting a solution that's probably based on assumption. What I do anyway is I quickly just draft a concept design of what they want to see. And then, I mean, if you don't have time, you don't have time. So, I don't know what you can do here, but like what I like to do also is explore my own concept designs. And then when I actually show it to them, the first thing I do is I show the concept design that I think they want, that they have suggested based on, my conversations with them, that I know that they think is the one that they want to see or they think is the best solution. But then I simultaneously also show my own concepts where I'm like, so I understand that, you want to present it like this and you feel like this, but I've also explored other concepts that I think, solve this problem in a little bit of a more, what's the, you want to be very delicate here because you don't want to feel like you're shooting anyone's down, but you can say like a little more optimal idea or a better design way. And then I show my concepts to them. And usually there's like some psychology involved here, but I almost always find a way to kind of, it's like a Jedi mind trick to get them to buy my concept, because they can see theirs and mine side by side, and I can speak to both of them very clearly. And because I have a concept that is based on my experience as a UX designer, based on my understanding of visual communication, visual design, and the expertise that I have, I can speak to why this concept I think is better or is more optimal. And usually I'm able to get them to buy into my concept. And in your case, where you're limited on time, what I would suggest doing is just maybe focus more on communicating the value of exploring other concepts and have them even in a very, very lo-fi stage if possible. It could be like, hand-drawn wireframes or a wireframe kit, but just give them visually something to see that entices them, almost like you're fishing, almost like bait. Try to present something, here's what you want, here's your design in a concept form, but I really think that we should explore some other solutions. And I've been dabbling a little bit with solutions. I haven't had a lot of time to really explore these, but I think we should look at, potentially solving the problem like this. And, try to use a little bit of psychology, try to get them to buy into, going in that direction. That would be my suggestion.
I'll also just read out what. Thank you, Eric. I'd also just read out for what Eric Christoph said here. It's always an option to discuss whether the current process and timelines are working or not. Sometimes better to reevaluate than just to push forward for the sake
Yep.
of old decisions that are not appropriate anymore. You say you agree with that. I agree with that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. It kind of depends on, the relationship you have with the people and, how tight the deadline is. But if you're able to, communicate and let them know, hey, this is a situation, this would really benefit from more time. Like let's take a moment to reevaluate, our approach, our speed. That is probably the optimal position.
Are there any more questions from the audience? If you don't want to talk, you're free to talk, or you can pop your questions into the chat as well. Okay. I don't know if you can see the chat messages as well, Eric.
Yeah, I can see them. I'm looking at them. Yeah, no problem, Paper Pish. And I'm glad the project lets you explore concepts.
So it's actually coming up to a time to slowly wrap up the call now. We still have a few minutes, but I'm also going to shill Another call that's
Oh,
happening
not.
basically straight after this, we actually have a prototyping call for the Bitcoin Core app project, which is working on a very specific user flow, and that's happening straight after this call. So I'll pretty much be stopping the recording after the call, having a super quick break, and then jumping on again. And that's going to be a whole prototyping session for people who want to learn about prototyping or just want to contribute to the Bitcoin Core app project. So I'll go ahead and show that call as well. It's on the same link that we're on right now.
Okay, and is it like high fidelity prototyping on Figma, like showing examples of how you can conduct interactions and things like that?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to need to lean into to Christoph on that one, because in terms of the interactions that you create, you have slide up and then you have slide to the left as well. There's so many different interactive states, and we're going to be doing almost like a learning session on
Oh, nice.
how to, when do you use slide up, when do you use slide to the left, when are those appropriate to use. So yeah, it's going to be a learning session, and we're going to prototype. I think we have um, two different people within the project have created designs, and we're going to try to prototype both of their designs. It's going to be a hands-on session. So
That's
yeah,
pretty cool. It's for the Bitcoin Core
it's
redesign?
for Bitcoin Core app. Yeah.
Nice.
Oh, there's
Great.
another question from Paper Site coming up. How do you deal with imposter syndrome? Who'd like to answer that?
I don't.
Okay, I'll give a very honest. I see Eric was supposed to, but I'll give a very short and sweet one. When I entered into the ecosystem and I was thrown in as a Spiral grantee with all the people that I was working with, and I would jump on calls with them, and I'd be like, holy shizzles, what language are these people talking? I have no idea what they're talking about. Imposter syndrome hit really hard, and it hit really big. And I actually spoke about that at a conference presentation that I gave when I was I think this was in Berlin. It was an open source conference, FOSS conference that I spoke at last year. I was really honest about how I felt. I think the first thing is be very honest about it. Like, just, it's okay. It's be okay with admitting that you feel like an imposter. And then the second thing that I did was I was like, I then, tapped into my own unique skill set. And I said to myself, I would not be here if my skill set was not needed. My particular skill set was needed, and I would not be here if my skill set was needed. So I own that as well. So one part of it was basically just being, I'm okay to feel like an imposter. And the other thing was like, okay, I can do this and I'm here for a reason, because otherwise you would not have been hired. So it took two sides to the coin. You have a very particular set of specialities that you're good in that your colleagues do not have, and you have to just own that. It's not about being egotistical or anything like that. It's just owning it, own what you're good at, and do it. But yeah, Eric, feel free to chime in as well.
Yeah, so I mean, what you just said, I think is really the crux, is like understanding that if you were hired for something, you're an expert at it, or you're somebody who has the capability to go find the resources and speak to them. So I do kind of two things. Is one, I practice before, and I take a lot of notes. I have notes right here. Um, I think I get my before I jump into a call or a presentation. I think about what are the messages that I want to convey. What is an important thing for me to touch on? Like on my notes here, I literally have design equals solving problems with experience design and visual design techniques. Because I thought about that and I was like, okay, I need to emphasize that. That's clear. I want to say things like that. So one is taking notes and clearing your head, journaling, having a clear understanding of what it is you want to communicate. And something else that helps me, especially in UX, is to reference the work that's already been done by, I don't know about leaders, but like by people that have a lot of experience. Things like the Nielsen Norman Group or Jacob Nielsen, or whoever. It doesn't have to be them, but like if you can reference and understand why certain things are in place and be able to speak to why these conventions make sense or why this practice is good, you'll feel a lot more confident when you communicate or when you can say it, because you'll know that if somebody might have a question about it, well, I can speak to a source, or that hey, there's a reason why I'm saying that this is the best because I've done a little bit of research. So to me, it comes down to practice and research, and the more you embed yourself in it, the more those two things happen naturally, and eventually you get to the point where you just feel like, hey, I've accumulated enough knowledge where the answers that I give are rooted in either my own experience or research that I've done, and I feel good about these answers.
Michael, you wanted to say something?
Oh, I was just, thinking. Then it also comes, I think, a bit down to the topic that is being discussed, because some of or a lot of the times, it depends on what the kind of the level of altitude is as well. I mean, are we talking about, let's say, stylistic matters of taste,